December 19, 1944. A frozen ridge north of Neuville, Belgium. Inside an M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, Private First Class Ray Thompson pressed his face against the periscope, his breath fogging the glass with each shallow exhale. The cold bit through the metal hull like a living thing, seeping into his bones, making his fingers stiff on the controls. Beyond the skeletal trees and snow-heavy sky, a German armored column snaked toward him. 12 vehicles. A Tiger, eye-heavy tank leading the procession, followed by Panzer IVs, half-tracks crammed with infantry, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers. A perfect armored spearhead moving with terrifying precision toward a vital crossroads. His orders were crystal clear. Observe and report. Do not engage. Do not fire. Wait for command authorization. Thompson watched the column draw closer, his tactical mind already calculating angles, distances, vulnerabilities. One wrong shell could mean a dozen dead Americans from friendly fire incidents that had plagued the chaotic front lines. But as he watched that steel serpent wind through the narrow forest road, a different equation formed in his head. Behind him, 20,000 men of the 101st Airborne Division were encircled in Bastogne. This crossroads was their last major supply route. And this column wasn't just passing through, it was moving to cut that lifeline permanently. Waiting was no longer caution, waiting was suicide. Without a single command, without clearance, without permission, Ray Thompson made a decision that violated every rule he had been taught. His hand moved to the firing mechanism, and everything changed. But to understand why that single moment mattered, you need to know who Raymond Charles Thompson really was. He grew up in western Kansas, the son of a mechanic and a math teacher. While other kids saw cars and tractors, Ray saw angles and leverage points, gear ratios and force multipliers. The world spoke to him in patterns. He enlisted in 1942, hoping for engineering training, and ended up as a gunner in the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion. His crewmates called him the Quiet Clock because of his methodical precision. Never rushed, never panicked, just calculated, aimed, fired. He had seen combat before, in the hedgerows of Normandy, where he watched friends die in the grinding chaos of close-quarters fighting. That experience taught him something the training manuals never mentioned. There were no lucky shots in war, only patterns you understood and patterns you didn't. The survivors were the ones who learned to see the geometry of death before it saw them. So Thompson did something unusual for a gunner. He kept a notebook. In it, he sketched German vehicles from every engagement, noted their vulnerabilities, measured the angles where armor was thinnest. He studied them the way a chess player studies endgames, and he waited for the moment when that knowledge would matter. But there was something else everyone had to understand about December 1944. The propaganda wasn't coming from Berlin. It was coming from American command itself. The rule was simple and absolute. No one fires without confirmation from command. It had been drilled into every soldier after the German offensive began on December 16th. Operation Watch on the Rhine had hit the American lines with over 200,000 men and more than 1,000 tanks, achieving total surprise. In the chaos, American units had fired on each other, mistaking retreating allies for advancing enemies. The friendly fire casualties were devastating. So command imposed the rule: hold your fire until ordered. It made sense in theory, but theory was crumbling under the weight of reality. The German advance was too fast. Communication lines were cut or jammed. Radio silence was often complete for hours. And the rule that was meant to prevent tragedy had become something else entirely. It had become a paralyzing dogma. A straitjacket that prevented American forces from reacting to threats until it was too late. Thompson knew the statistics because he had lived them. His M10's 3-inch gun could penetrate the 82mm side armor of a Tiger I at 800 yards, but it was useless against the 102mm frontal armor. Meanwhile, the Tiger's 88mm gun could punch through his thin 38mm armor from over a mile away. He was outgunned, out-armored, and alone on that ridge. The German column he was watching represented a textbook armored assault. Tiger for breakthrough, Panzer IVs for support, infantry for consolidation, fuel and ammunition in the rear. If they reached that crossroads, they would seal the noose around Bastogne. Thousands of American paratroopers would be cut off, starved, and eventually overrun. Thompson understood all of this in the space of a few heartbeats. He just didn't know yet that he would be the one to decide the outcome. Because sometimes war doesn't reward those who follow instructions. It rewards the ones who understand when to break them. The column entered the narrow, tree-lined road. Thompson watched them move with predatory focus. They weren't just moving down a road. They were entering a trap. And they didn't even know it yet. The road was flanked by dense forest on both sides, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles abreast. The Germans maintained their tight formation, confident in their armor, confident in American paralysis. The Tiger led, its massive profile unmistakable even in the winter fog. Behind it, the column stretched like a steel serpent, each vehicle trusting the one ahead, maintaining intervals, moving with the mechanical precision of a well-trained force. Thompson's hand moved to the elevation dial. His loader, Corporal Hayes, noticed the movement and froze. Thompson didn't look at him. He was calculating. Distance, 700 yards. Wind, minimal. Target, not the Tiger. That was the mistake everyone would expect. Hitting the Tiger's frontal armor would do nothing except announce his position and invite instant destruction. No, he was going to hit the third vehicle, a Panzer IV. His crosshairs settled on the tank's flank as it navigated a slight curve in the road. Thin armor, vulnerable. He exhaled slowly, steadying his breathing, and pulled the trigger. The M10 erupted with a violence that shattered the frozen silence of the Ardennes. The shell screamed across the distance and punched into the Panzer IV's side armor. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. The tank shuddered, belched black smoke, and died in the middle of the road. The German column ground to a halt. Thompson didn't wait to see the result. His mind was already 3 moves ahead. Hayes, stunned for only a heartbeat, rammed another shell into the breach with practiced efficiency. The driver, Miller, adjusted their position slightly, backing them a few yards to change the angle. The assistant gunner, Kowalski, was already scanning for German infantry attempting to flank them. They didn't question him. They saw what he saw. The logic was brutal and perfect. Thompson's second target was already in his sights, the 6th vehicle, an infantry half-track packed with German soldiers. He fired. The shell hit true, and the half-track exploded in a shower of metal and flame. Now the column wasn't just halted, it was jammed. Vehicles couldn't move forward past the burning Panzer IV. Couldn't reverse past the destroyed half-track. They were boxed in, and panic was beginning to ripple through the formation. The third shot was the kill stroke. Thompson aimed for the 8th vehicle, a fuel truck. His shell hit the tanker dead center, and the explosion was biblical. A fireball mushroomed into the gray sky, raining burning fuel onto the surrounding vehicles and forest. The psychological impact was instant and total. The Germans believed they were in a massive, coordinated ambush. Inside the column, chaos reigned. Tank commanders, trained to respond to threats from known positions, found themselves taking fire from what seemed like multiple directions. Thompson had repositioned slightly after each shot, using the terrain and forest to mask his true location. To the Germans, it felt like a full battery of tank destroyers had them surrounded. They called it the Ghost Battery in later intelligence reports. A phantom American force that struck with surgical precision from invisible positions. But it wasn't a force. It was one man with a notebook full of sketches and a mind that understood geometry better than orders. The Germans returned fire, but they were shooting at shadows. Shells exploded in the forest, tearing through trees, sending splinters of frozen wood screaming through the air. But Thompson wasn't where they thought he was. He was already lining up his next shot. The Tiger was pivoting now, its massive turret traversing slowly, searching for the threat. The tank commander knew his frontal armor was impenetrable. He was trying to present that armor, to dare the American gunners to waste their shells. But Thompson wasn't looking at the front. He was waiting, watching, calculating. The Tiger completed its turn, trying to bring its 88mm gun to bear. For just a moment, for just a sliver of time, the hull exposed its side. 82mm of armor, vulnerable at this range. Thompson fired his fifth shell. The round hit the Tiger's side plating and punched through. Inside, the shell found the ammunition storage. The internal explosion was so violent it blew the turret completely off the chassis. 47 tons of German engineering became a funeral pyre in less than 3 seconds. With the Tiger gone and half the column in flames, the remaining German forces broke. Infantry abandoned their vehicles and fled into the forest. Drivers threw their trucks into reverse, colliding with vehicles behind them in the desperate scramble to escape. The perfect, disciplined formation disintegrated into a rout. Kowalski lowered his binoculars and turned to Thompson. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. "Are we still going to get court-martialed for this?" Thompson didn't answer. He just reached for another shell and loaded it into the breech. His hands were trembling now, the adrenaline finally catching up with his body. But his eyes were steady, cold, because he knew what was coming next, and it had nothing to do with German armor. For 48 hours, Thompson waited for the arrest that never came. The adrenaline that had carried him through the engagement drained away, replaced by a creeping dread that settled in his stomach like ice water. He filed his after-action report in meticulous detail, complete with sketches showing each target, each angle, each calculated decision. He handed it to Captain Langston and waited. Langston read the report in his tent, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been grudging admiration. When he finally looked up, his voice was carefully neutral. "No one authorized this engagement, Private." "No, sir. Communications were down. I made a tactical assessment and acted." "You violated direct standing orders." "Yes, sir." Langston set the report down and rubbed his face. "I have to send this upstairs. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." The crew didn't celebrate. They barely spoke. They maintained their equipment, ate their rations, and waited for the hammer to fall. But something strange was happening. Scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived at the crossroads expecting to fight their way through a panzer column. Instead, they found smoldering wreckage. 7 vehicles destroyed, 4 more disabled, 0 American casualties. They asked which unit had engaged the Germans. Langston told them it wasn't a unit, it was one gunner. The investigation began 3 days later. A colonel from division headquarters arrived with a manila folder and a grim expression. He questioned Thompson for 2 hours, going over every detail of the engagement. Why did you fire? Why that sequence? Why those targets? Thompson answered every question with the same methodical precision he had used on the ridge. He didn't make excuses. He didn't claim heroism. He simply explained the geometry. The Tiger couldn't be penetrated from the front, so he removed the Tiger's ability to maneuver. The column couldn't retreat if the middle was blocked, so he blocked it. The Germans would break faster if they believed they faced overwhelming force, so he created that illusion. The colonel listened, made notes, and left without indicating what would happen next. Then Langston returned with a message that changed everything. He closed the tent flap and spoke quietly. Division commander says this doesn't go in the official briefing. No commendation, no public record. But he wanted me to tell you something. They'll be watching your work. You're being reassigned to training duties, and they want your diagrams sent to Fort Sill. Thompson blinked. The artillery school? They want to study what you did. In that moment, Thompson understood. They hadn't just forgiven him, they were studying him. The actions of one man who broke the rules were about to rewrite them for everyone else. That's when it hit him. They hadn't just forgiven what he did, they were studying it. The actions of one man who broke the rules were about to rewrite them for everyone else. Stories like Ray Thompson's are a powerful reminder that history is made by individuals, often in moments no one planned for. If you believe these hidden stories deserve to be told, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thompson spent the rest of the war teaching other gunners his controlled collapse theory. That's what they eventually called it. Asymmetrical engagement sequencing. The art of disabling an enemy formation by creating chaos at calculated points. He never used words like hero or bravery. He talked about angles, about patterns, about understanding that sometimes the most disciplined action is knowing when discipline itself becomes the enemy. When the war ended in May 1945, Thompson returned to Kansas. He married a woman he had known since grade school, opened a small engine repair shop in the same town where he had learned to see the world in gears and leverage points. He lived quietly, raised 2 children, and never spoke about the war unless someone asked directly. Decades later, a military historian researching the Battle of the Bulge tracked down the elderly Thompson. The historian had found references to an unnamed gunner at Noville, whose engagement had been studied at multiple war colleges. It took years to connect the name to the action. When asked about that day on the frozen ridge, Thompson was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I remember how still it was before the first shot, how clear everything seemed. I didn't break the rules. I just stepped past them for a minute, long enough to do what had to be done." The historian pressed for more, asked about the fear, the weight of the decision, the aftermath. Thompson just shook his head. "I was a gunner. I saw a target. I did the math. That's all." But it wasn't all. In the years after Thompson's engagement, the U.S. Army quietly integrated his tactics into armor doctrine. During the Cold War, when military planners gamed out scenarios against Soviet armored columns, they used principles Thompson had demonstrated on that December day. Spiel in a seriously tone, not just the vehicles. Create chaos at calculated points. Make the enemy believe they face a force larger than reality. A colonel who taught at Fort Benning in the 1960s, when asked about the origin of these tactics, said something remarkable. "We had a case study from the Bulge. 1 gunner, 12 vehicles. He didn't break orders, he operated beyond them. Thompson died in 1998 at the age of 76. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service in World War II, but included no details. A brief ceremony at the VFW Hall, a folded flag presented to his widow, the quiet conclusion of a quiet life. But in a filing cabinet at the U.S. Army Armor School at Fort Benning, there is still a manila folder marked with a case number from December 1944. Inside are sketches drawn by a Kansas farm boy who understood that courage isn't always about following orders. Sometimes it's about understanding the deeper duty behind them. 1 gunner, 1 decision, 1 pattern that changed the rules. The boy from Kansas who saw the world in angles used geometry to halt an army. He never sought glory, only a solution. And in that frozen moment on a Belgian ridge, when doctrine collided with necessity, Ray Thompson proved that the most dangerous weapon in any war isn't the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It's a disciplined mind that knows exactly when to break free from discipline itself. That's the story they don't teach in the textbooks. The story of how one man's disobedience became everyone else's doctrine. The story of Ray Thompson, the lone gunner of Noville, who understood that sometimes saving lives means breaking the rules designed to protect them. Tuesday, July 13, 1943. Camp Swift, Bastrop County, Texas. Nachrichtenhelfer Greta Müller stood in the processing line, her gray Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform stiff with dried sweat and African dust, watching an American soldier hand each prisoner ahead of her a glass bottle filled with dark, fizzing liquid. The July heat pressed down like a physical weight. Cicadas screamed from the pine trees surrounding the barbed wire. But what made Greta's hands tremble wasn't the temperature or exhaustion from the 3-week journey from Tunisia. It was the bottle itself. Ice cold, beading with condensation. Casually given away to enemies of the state. Behind her, Leutnant Weber whispered what they all thought. Vergiftet, it has to be poisoned. Coca-Cola, the American guard said in fractured German, smiling as he handed Greta her bottle. Welcome to Texas. She stared at the bottle in her palm. Cold, actually cold. In Africa, she'd gone weeks without clean water. Here, in the land she'd been taught was on the brink of collapse, they gave prisoners ice-cold beverages, like it meant nothing. Greta was 23 years old, born in Hamburg to a postal clerk and a seamstress. She'd volunteered for the Nachrichtenhelfer in 1941, trained as a radio operator, and shipped to North Africa with Field Marshal Rommel's communications unit. For 2 years, she'd decoded messages in tents that reached 50 degrees Celsius, subsisted on ersatz coffee and hardtack, and watched the Afrika Korps slowly starve while British supply lines seemed endless. The propaganda broadcast spoke of American weakness, of a mongrel nation too soft to fight, of cities crippled by strikes and racial violence. But the evidence kept contradicting the words. More trucks, more planes, more of everything. Then came the surrender at Tunisia in May. 130,000 Axis soldiers, including nearly 400 women serving in auxiliary roles, became prisoners in a single week. The transport ship to America had been clean, uncomfortably clean. The bunks had mattresses. There was food twice daily. Hot food. Now, Greta stood in the Texas heat, holding impossibly cold Coca-Cola, and felt the first crack in everything she'd been taught to believe. The numbers told one story. Germany produced 3,000 trucks per month in 1942. America, 50,000. German soldiers received 1,500 calories daily by 1943. American POWs, 4,000. The Reich's entire annual oil production reached 6 million tons. American production exceeded 200 million. But statistics were abstract. This bottle, this single gesture, was concrete. And it was terrifying. She twisted the cap. The carbonation hissed. The smell hit her first, sweet and foreign. Weber watched with hollow eyes as she brought it to her lips. The liquid was so cold it hurt her teeth. So sweet she nearly gagged. But underneath the shock, something else emerged. It was real. It was abundant. And the American guard had given it to her, without hesitation, without ceremony, as though ice-cold beverages for prisoners were the most natural thing in the world. What Greta didn't know was that this moment, this simple bottle, was just the beginning. Over the next 18 months, everything she believed about enemies and allies, about strength and weakness, about who she was supposed to hate and why, would unravel completely. And in that unraveling, she would discover something more dangerous than any weapon: the possibility of choosing her own truth. The barracks at Camp Swift had been built for American soldiers before being converted for POW use. They had wooden floors. Real floors, not dirt. Bunks with thin mattresses, but mattresses nonetheless. Screens on the windows to keep out mosquitoes. When Greta entered her assigned building, she found 30 other women already inside, mostly auxiliaries from various units, a few nurses. They clustered in groups, speaking in low voices, their eyes constantly moving to the doors. Obergefreite Anna Schmidt from Munich sat on a lower bunk, her hands folded in her lap. She'd served with a Luftwaffe communications unit in Sicily. "The showers have hot water," she said quietly. "I checked. Hot water whenever you want it." The words hung in the air. In Africa, hot water had been a distant memory. Most days, there'd been barely enough for drinking. Here, their captors offered hot showers to prisoners? It made no sense. That first night, Greta lay on her bunk and listened to the unfamiliar sounds. Crickets in the pines, distant laughter from the American barracks. No artillery, no bombs, no one crying. She thought of Hamburg, where by now British and American bombers had reduced whole neighborhoods to rubble. She thought of her mother's letters, increasingly brief, speaking of rations cut again, of queues for bread that lasted hours, of cousins killed on the Eastern Front. Here, in the enemy's heartland, the lights stayed on, the water ran, the prisoners ate regularly. The contradiction gnawed at her. Thursday, July 15, 1943, Camp Swift Mess Hall. Greta stood in line with her tin tray, watching as American cooks dolloped food onto each prisoner's plate. White bread, actual white bread, not the gray sawdust mixture they'd eaten in Africa. Beef stew with visible chunks of meat, potatoes, green beans, butter, real butter, not the rancid margarine mixture that passed for fat in the Reich. Anna stood beside her, staring at her plate. "This is more meat than I saw in 3 months at my post." The mess hall buzzed with similar conversations. 40 women, most in their early 20s, confronting abundance they'd been told didn't exist. Greta sat at a long wooden table and ate slowly, methodically. The beef was tender, seasoned. The bread was soft. She thought of the propaganda broadcasts that described America as a nation of homeless bread lines and empty store shelves. She thought of Minister Goebbels' voice on the radio, describing the American soldier as poorly equipped and demoralized. Weber sat across from her, tears streaming down her face as she ate. "My God," she whispered, "they're feeding us better than our own soldiers." It was true. German Wehrmacht rations had dropped to 1,800 calories daily by mid-1943. Frontline troops often received less. Here, American authorities provided POWs with 3,500 calories per day, per Geneva Convention standards. The United States could afford to feed its enemies more than Germany fed its sons. That night, Greta wrote in the small notebook she'd managed to keep. Day 3. They gave us seconds at dinner. Seconds! As though food wasn't precious. I don't understand this country. The work assignments began the following week. POWs at Camp Swift weren't idle. They were put to work in agriculture, helping with the massive labor shortage caused by so many American men serving overseas. Greta and 15 other women were assigned to a cotton farm 20 miles from camp, owned by a man named Thomas Crawford. Monday, July 19, 1943. Crawford's farm, outside Smithville, Texas. The truck dropped them at dawn. Crawford stood in his driveway, a weathered man in his 50s, with sun-creased eyes and dirt under his fingernails. He wore dental overalls and a wide-brimmed hat. Behind him, a white farmhouse with a porch, chickens in the yard, a red barn that looked like something from a postcard. He looked at the line of German women and spoke in slow, simple English. The American guard translated. "You work 6 hours daily. Breaks every 2 hours. Water whenever you need it. Lunch provided. Any questions?" Greta had never heard a captor ask prisoners if they had questions. The guard carried a rifle, but it stayed slung over his shoulder. Crawford's manner was businesslike, but not unkind. He showed them to the cotton fields, explained the work, then did something that stunned them all. He went to work alongside them. The farm owner working next to his prisoners? Greta bent to the cotton plants, her fingers remembering similar work from her childhood, helping her uncle on his small plot outside Hamburg. But everything else felt surreal. Every hour, Crawford's wife, Mary, brought out jugs of cold water and lemonade, actual lemonade. She smiled when she handed Greta a cup, a genuine smile, no malice in it, no contempt. At noon, they stopped for lunch. Sandwiches with thick slices of ham and cheese, apples, cookies still warm from the oven. The women sat in the shade of an oak tree, eating silently, processing what couldn't be processed. This was the enemy. These were the people they'd been taught to hate. Anna bit into her sandwich and closed her eyes. How can they afford this? The numbers provided the answer, though accepting them was harder. American industrial production in 1943 exceeded the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy. The United States produced 300,000 aircraft that year alone. Germany managed 40,000. American farms generated such surplus that the government paid farmers to reduce planting. While Germans queued for rationed bread, Americans worried about overproduction. The gap wasn't small. It was a chasm. But Greta couldn't reconcile statistics with propaganda. The radio broadcasts from Berlin described America as weak, divided, on the edge of internal collapse. The food in her hand suggested something entirely different. Thursday, August 5, 1943. Crawford's farm. 3 weeks into the work assignment. Greta had settled into a routine. Morning transport, 6 hours in the fields, lunch, return to camp. The work was hard, but not brutal. The heat was oppressive, but they had water. And slowly, incrementally, she began to notice other things. Crawford had 2 sons. Both were overseas. One in the Pacific, one in North Africa. Mary showed them photographs once during lunch. Young men in American uniforms, smiling for the camera. Greta looked at those photos and realized something uncomfortable. Those soldiers, Crawford's sons, might have fought against her unit, might have captured her. And yet his parents fed her, gave her cold water, treated her with basic dignity. She'd been taught that Americans were ruthless mongrels, culturally inferior, morally bankrupt. But Crawford woke at 5 every morning to work his farm. Mary maintained their home and volunteered at the church. They'd sent their sons to fight and still found kindness for enemy prisoners. It didn't match. None of it matched. One afternoon, while collecting tools after work, Crawford spoke to her in halting German. He'd been learning from a book. Wie geht es dir? How are you? A simple question. But hearing it in her language from this American farmer broke something in Greta's chest. She answered in English, words she'd been practicing. I am good, thank you. He nodded and smiled. Your English is improving. Later, Anna asked her, why are you learning their language? Greta didn't have an answer that made sense, or maybe she did and didn't want to admit it. She was learning English because the Americans weren't temporary captors. They were people, and people deserved to be understood. Saturday, August 28, 1943, Camp Swift Recreation Yard. The American authorities had established a recreation program, books in German from the camp library, a volleyball court, weekly film screenings, mostly documentaries and newsreels. Greta sat in the audience one evening and watched footage of American war production. Factories stretching for miles, assembly lines producing bombers at rates that seemed impossible, ships launched daily from multiple yards. She'd seen the Wochenschau newsreels in Germany, triumphant music over footage of German victories. They'd stopped showing those by 1942. The victories had stopped. But the propaganda broadcasts continued, insisting Germany was winning, that America was struggling, that final victory approached. The footage on the screen suggested something else entirely. This wasn't a nation struggling. This was a nation operating at a scale Germany couldn't match. Greta thought of Hamburg's factories, already bombed repeatedly by 1943. She thought of the food shortages, the lack of fuel, the crumbling infrastructure. The comparison was devastating. Weber sat beside her, watching the same footage. When the lights came up, she turned to Greta with wet eyes. We were never going to win, were we? Greta had no answer, but she was beginning to understand that the question itself was the beginning of something larger. Something she couldn't yet name, but felt growing inside her. Doubt. Tuesday, September 7th, 1943. Crawford's farm. The cotton harvest was in full swing. Greta worked alongside Anna and Weber, moving between rows in the early morning coolness before the Texas heat became unbearable. At 8 o'clock, a truck pulled into the driveway. A young man climbed out, lean and sun-browned, wearing civilian clothes and a slight limp. Thomas Crawford walked over, and Greta heard them talking. The young man was David Mitchell, Crawford's neighbor. He'd served in North Africa with the 1st Armored Division, took shrapnel near Kasserine Pass in February, was recovering at home, helping his father's farm when he could manage. He was 26 years old. David glanced toward the prisoners in the field. His gaze lingered on Greta for a moment before he turned back to Crawford. They spoke for several minutes. Then David walked to his truck, retrieved a large jug of water, and carried it to the field. Figured you might need this before the heat gets worse, he said in English. The guard translated. Greta took the cup he offered. Their fingers brushed. She looked up at his face, saw the scar along his jawline, saw eyes that held something she recognized, exhaustion, the particular weariness of someone who'd seen combat. They'd been enemies on the same battlefields months ago. Now he was bringing her water. "Danke," she said. Then, in careful English, "Thank you." "You're learning," he said, and something in his voice wasn't mocking or suspicious. It sounded almost pleased. He came back 3 days later, then again the following week. At first, he brought supplies or helped Crawford with equipment, but Greta noticed he often worked near wherever she was assigned. They spoke in fragments, her English improving, his German non-existent, but his patience evident. He taught her words for farm tools, for plants, for the Texas landscape. She taught him to count in German, laughed when he botched the pronunciation. Mary Crawford noticed. She mentioned it once to Greta during lunch, her voice carefully neutral. "David's been coming around more often." Greta felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. "He is kind." "He is," Mary agreed, "but you should know, it's complicated. You're still a prisoner. He's American. People will talk." People did talk. Greta heard whispers among the other prisoners. Fraternization was forbidden. Relationships between prisoners and American civilians strictly prohibited. But David kept coming, and Greta kept finding excuses to work near wherever he was. They spoke in mixed German and English, building a vocabulary that belonged only to them. He told her about the farm he'd inherit one day, about the brothers who'd left for war, and the sister who was a nurse in England. She told him about Hamburg, about her parents, about the radio operator job that had sent her to Africa. She didn't tell him about the propaganda, about what she'd been taught about Americans. The evidence of her own eyes had already answered those questions. Thursday, October 21, 1943. Crawford's farm. 4 months into the work assignment. The cotton harvest was nearly complete. David sat with Greta during lunch break, both of them in the oak tree shade, sharing the space where prisoners and civilians technically weren't supposed to mix, but somehow did anyway. He'd brought a photograph. His family before the war. Parents, 4 children, all smiling. This was 1939, he said, before everything changed. Greta looked at the photo and saw what she'd seen in her own family pictures. Ordinary people, not monsters, not the enemy. Just people who wanted their children safe and their harvests good and their lives peaceful. "Your family is beautiful," she said in English. He looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "Greta, I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. This was dangerous ground. They both knew it. "I don't see an enemy when I look at you," he said quietly. "I know I'm supposed to. I know what the regulations say. But I see someone who got caught up in something bigger than any of us. Someone who deserves better than she got." Greta's throat tightened. "I was told Americans were cruel, that you would torture prisoners, that your country was savage and uncivilized." David's jaw clenched. "What do you think now?" She looked around, at the farm, at the food. At Mary Crawford, who'd brought out fresh bread and jam without hesitation. At the oak tree's shade, and the cold water, and the simple kindness she'd encountered every single day since arriving. "I think I was lied to," she whispered, "about everything." The words hung between them. Then David reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away. He took her hand, just held it. The touch was gentle, respectful, and absolutely forbidden. "What happens when the war ends?" Greta asked. "When I have to go back?" David's grip tightened. "Maybe you don't have to." The idea was radical, impossible. Prisoners were repatriated, that was the rule. But David's hand in hers was real. His farm was real. This country, which had fed her and clothed her and treated her better than her own military ever had, was real. For the first time since her capture, Greta allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't include returning to the rubble of Hamburg. Thursday, November 11, 1943. Camp Swift. Armistice Day. The Americans held a small ceremony. The camp commander spoke about sacrifice and peace and the hope that wars would end. Greta stood in the assembly with the other prisoners and listened to words about hope for future reconciliation. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was already reconciling, in ways that terrified her. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "I came here believing I knew who the enemy was." But how can they be enemies when they feed us, treat us with dignity, and see us as human beings? How can David be my enemy when his touch is the kindest thing I've experienced in years? I think the real enemy was the lies we were told, and I think I've been on the wrong side this entire time. The realization should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like freedom. The relationship deepened over the winter months. David visited the farm whenever Greta's work crew was there. They spoke for hours, his English teaching her American phrases, her German teaching him words for emotions that English lacked. They held hands when the guards weren't watching. Once, in December, behind the barn, he kissed her. It was brief and chaste, and absolutely against every regulation. It was also the most honest thing Greta had felt since capture. Mary Crawford knew. Thomas knew. The guards probably suspected, but no one reported it. Perhaps because the alternative, maintaining absolute separation between former enemies, felt increasingly absurd as the months passed. Or perhaps because kindness, once started, was hard to stop. By spring 1944, the relationship was an open secret. Other prisoners noticed. Some disapproved, seeing it as betrayal. Others understood. Weber, surprisingly, was supportive. "We were told they were monsters," she said once, "but they're just people. If you found one worth loving, then love him. God knows this war has taken enough from us." Sunday, June 4, 1944. Crawford's Farm. News reached camp that American forces had entered Rome. The invasion of France would come any day. Greta sat with David under the oak tree, both knowing the war was entering its final phase. Germany was losing. Everyone knew it now, even those who'd clung to propaganda the longest. "When it ends," David said, "there will be repatriation. They'll send you back." Greta had thought about this constantly for months. Hamburg was gone, reduced to ruins by bombing. Her father had died in an air raid the previous October. Her mother's last letter spoke of living in a basement shelter, of eating potato peels and bark soup. Going back meant returning to devastation, to a country that would blame its citizens for losing, to a future as bleak as the present was grim. "What if I don't go back?" she asked. David turned to face her fully. "Is that what you want?" "I want a life," she said, "a real life. Not picking through rubble in a defeated country. Not being forever marked as someone who served them, even in a minor capacity. I want what we have here, the farm, the oak tree, you." "It won't be easy," David warned. "You'll face prejudice, questions. Some people will never forgive you for being German." "Some people will never forgive me for leaving Germany," Greta countered. "Either way, I lose something too." David pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold ring, worn but beautiful. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "I'm not supposed to have this conversation. You're not supposed to say yes. But Greta Müller, when this war ends and when the regulations allow, "Will you marry me and stay in Texas?" She looked at the ring, at David's hopeful, nervous face, at the farm stretching around them, peaceful and productive, at the life being offered, impossible and real all at once. "Yes," she said. Tuesday, May 8, 1945. Camp Swift. The war in Europe ended. Greta stood in the assembly yard with hundreds of other prisoners, listening to the announcement. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Reich had collapsed. Hitler was dead. It was over. Around her, prisoners reacted in different ways. Some wept with relief, some with grief. Some stood stone-faced, processing the end of everything they'd known. Weber turned to Greta with red-rimmed eyes. "We lost." But Greta looked at the guard who'd announced the news, at the American flag flying over the camp, at the world she'd come to know over 2 years of captivity. "We survived," she said. "Maybe that's enough." The repatriation process began that summer, but it was slow. Logistics, paperwork, ships returning soldiers home taking priority over prisoners. Greta waited, not entirely sure she wanted the transport to come. She'd filed paperwork, quietly, exploring options for staying. David had consulted lawyers. It was complicated, but not impossible. Some German POWs, particularly those who'd married American citizens or could prove they'd face persecution back home, were granted permission to remain. Greta's case was unusual. Female prisoners were rarer. Romantic relationships were controversial. But the lawyer David found argued that Greta had served only in auxiliary communications, posed no security risk, and had family ties in America through her engagement to a veteran. The paperwork crawled through military bureaucracy, while camps across America slowly emptied. Thursday, March 14, 1946. Immigration Office, Austin, Texas. Greta sat in a wooden chair, wearing a dress Mary Crawford had made for her, and faced an American immigration official. He reviewed her file with careful attention. "Miss Müller, you understand that choosing to remain in the United States means renouncing certain rights to return to Germany in the future?" "I understand," Greta said in English that no longer required translation. "And you're aware that as a former member of enemy forces, you'll face scrutiny and potential prejudice." "I am aware." He stamped her paperwork. "Welcome to America, Miss Müller, or should I say future Mrs. Mitchell." She walked out into Texas sunshine, holding papers that changed everything. David waited outside, leaning against his truck. When he saw her face, he grinned. "So, I'm staying," she said. He swept her into his arms, right there on the street, and kissed her. People stared. Some smiled. Others frowned. Greta didn't care. She'd crossed an ocean and a war to arrive at this moment, this choice, this unlikely future. They married in June 1946. Small ceremony at the Crawford farm. Mary's garden in full bloom. Some neighbors attended, some didn't. The local Baptist minister performed the service, speaking about redemption and new beginnings. Greta wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers. David wore his father's Sunday suit. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Greta thought about the girl who'd arrived 3 years earlier, terrified and indoctrinated, clutching propaganda like gospel. That girl was gone. This woman had learned that enemies could become friends, that kindness could transform, that home wasn't a place but a choice. In 1948, David's father passed away, and David inherited the farm. Greta worked alongside him, learning American farming techniques, adapting her German efficiency to Texas methods. They had their first child in 1949, a daughter they named Sarah. When Greta held her baby for the first time, she thought about the future this child would have. American, free, never taught to hate based on propaganda, never forced to choose between truth and loyalty. By 1950, most German POWs had been repatriated. Camps across America closed. The war became history, then memory, then eventually the subject of books and documentaries. Greta's choice to stay remained unusual, but not unique. Several hundred German prisoners ultimately settled in America, drawn by economic opportunity, family connections, or simply the desire to start over in a place not destroyed by war. In 1965, a university student researching POW experiences interviewed Greta in the farmhouse she and David had built. By then, she was 45 years old, mother of 3, grandmother of 1. The student asked about her decision to stay. Greta thought for a long moment before answering. "I came here believing Americans were barbaric. I was taught they'd torture us, starve us, treat us as animals. Instead, they gave us Coca-Cola, hot showers, more food than we'd seen in years. But it wasn't the abundance that changed me. It was the casual kindness, the way they treated us like human beings, even though we'd been enemies. That generosity, that fundamental decency, shattered everything I'd been taught. And in that shattering, I found something worth staying for." The student asked if she ever regretted her choice. "Regret?" Greta smiled. "I regret the war. I regret believing the lies. I regret the years I spent serving a regime that valued ideology over humanity. But staying here, marrying David, building this life, those are the things I'm most proud of. The war took so much from so many people, but it also gave me the chance to learn the truth, and that truth set me free." By the time Greta passed away in 1993, she'd lived longer in Texas than she had in Germany. Her children and grandchildren knew her as a woman who'd crossed an ocean and a war to build a life defined by choice, not circumstance. They knew the story of how she'd arrived as a prisoner and stayed as a citizen, how a bottle of Coca-Cola had been the first crack in a wall of propaganda, how kindness had proven more powerful than any weapon. At her funeral, David, now 76 and heartbroken, spoke briefly. "Greta always said the war taught her that enemies are created, but humanity is real. She crossed every line society drew, believing people mattered more than politics, and she was right. She was always right." The small stone marking her grave in the Smithville Cemetery bore simple words: Greta Mitchell, 1920–1993. From Hamburg to Texas, she chose love. That choice, made in a POW camp in 1945, had rippled forward through decades. Her children became teachers, farmers, nurses. Her grandchildren carried both German and American heritage. The farm she and David built still operated, run by their youngest son, and the oak tree where they'd first held hands still provided shade on hot Texas afternoons. History books would record that over 400,000 German POWs passed through American camps during World War II. Most returned home when the war ended, but a few hundred stayed, like Greta, choosing the unexpected life over the expected one. Their stories represented a quieter kind of victory, not of armies or ideologies, but of individuals recognizing shared humanity across enemy lines. Greta never forgot the moment she'd stood in line at Camp Swift, holding that first bottle of Coca-Cola, feeling her certainties crack. She'd spent decades afterward trying to explain that moment to people, how a simple gesture of abundance had revealed the lies she'd believed, how the enemy she'd feared had shown her more kindness than her own government ever had. How propaganda crumbled in the face of consistent, casual decency. In the end, the war hadn't just redistributed borders or toppled regimes. It had also created unexpected pathways for individuals to cross impossible divides. Greta had walked one of those pathways, from prisoner to citizen, from enemy to wife, from believer in lies to witness of truth. And in walking it, she'd proven that even in humanity's darkest hours, small acts of kindness could rewrite entire destinies. The bottle of Coca-Cola had accomplished what weapons never could. It had shown her the truth, and the truth, ultimately, had brought her home.